Assalamu alaikum and welcome everyone to another episode of Daanish TV's English language TV channel, the global voice of the Center for Islam and Decoloniality. And today it is my utmost privilege to have an incredibly dear friend from South Africa. That is, of course, my personal introduction to him. But this is, we have with us today an individual who certainly, not only in my biased opinion, but in global opinion, is one of the leading political economists in the world today. The work of our guest, Professor Patrick Bond, Professor of Development Studies and Political Economy in South Africa, it has been so transformative in terms of its analysis of what has gone on in Africa, in South Africa, and an analysis of the global political economy over the longue durée, over the 20th century, and up until today. And that, of course, is the topic for tonight. And I just can't emphasize enough. We do try to get, as I always say, some of our most not only brilliant minds, but those that are committed to a political praxis to try to transform the world to a more just and humane and ecological sustainable world, which is an area where, if he doesn't mind, I'll just call him Patrick as a dear friend. Where Patrick work has been instrumental, and his involvement in the movements for against global warming, on all types of climate justice movements, has been instrumental. So, with a very warm welcome, Patrick, please, we're very happy to have you on the show.
It's fantastic to be back in close touch, Junaid, and all power to you and your center and all of the activists in Pakistan and around the world that we can engage with now.
Absolutely. Wonderful, wonderful. And as I was mentioning to you before the show, that we always run out of time because there's so much to speak about, so much that I think we would love to kind of also have our viewership, also participate in, learn from, and so on. And of course, we will absolutely have, I think, more opportunities to do so. But today, we want to focus on area of your expertise, this global political economy, and a kind of rough sketch of kind of how we got here. And of course, we can't do may God bless his soul, a Wallistinian analysis of the world capitalist system from the late 60s, the long 16th century or anything. But I do want to focus on what I think that the central developments from the 20th century, beginning say from the Great Depression of starting 1929 in the 1930s, and what were the type of trends, the trends, economic trends from that period onwards, and the institutions set up to deal with this kind of new world economy that is emerging, post-war economy, and so on. So we discussed kind of how we wanted to kind of divide it up. So I mean, if we could speak about kind of that period first, but basically from the Great Depression till about the end of the 1960s and the 1970s, and what was so important that say Richard Nixon did then, and then entering into the era of the monster known as neoliberalism. So maybe if we can begin there, Patrick. I mean, just kind of giving us a broad sense of what was going on, and how did governments respond, and so on.
Yeah, let's think about the critical, relevant parallels and maybe draw some of them out quickly, because maybe you could say our Great Depression experience is now, with COVID-19 and the 2020 world recession, something we might learn from, because the word New Deal, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt's US program, which was part social spending, part infrastructure, part of military-based economic recovery from 1939, especially in 1941 after Pearl Harbor, and 42, 43, 44. The US economy actually turned on a dime. It was just extraordinary how, by invoking the need to defeat the Nazis, it was possible for Roosevelt to very rapidly restructure the US economy and, for example, tell Detroit, don't put out so many of those cars. We need tanks. You know, there's this sort of metaphor of a New Deal that allows you to do dramatic changes. And it had followed the decade of the Depression all around the world. In South Africa, there was an exception, because we had, underneath where I am here in Johannesburg, half the world's gold. So this wasn't a country in depression. In fact, it was booming at 8% growth a year, which then helped South Africa make the Bretton Woods Agreement, grounded in gold, a fixed price in 1944, very relevant to the ability of apartheid to sustain itself for another 40 years. But I think the main, 50 years actually, the main dilemma is if you go into a financialization bubble, which the West was in the 20s, and in 1929, it begins to burst, and it continues to burst through early 1933. The first thing that Roosevelt did as president was to close all the banks and to put in very tight regulations. So it went from a financial explosion, a bubble, a casino capitalism of the era, to tight regulation. For example, you couldn't, if you were a banker, you couldn't also lend and invest in the stock market at the same time. They made this Glass-Steagall Act. You couldn't lend in another state in the US. Those are really important, because although Elizabeth Warren and certainly Bernie Sanders had called for those kinds of regulations in the US, Joe Biden comes from the opposite tradition. He's the senator from the most criminal tax haven in the US, the state of Delaware, where the banks just go wilding, right? And he was instrumental in their Bankruptcy Act, which made it very difficult for people, including students, to get out of hock. Now, those are the dilemmas, right? That we need somebody at the world scale, and in each country, really, who's Franklin Roosevelt, to do new deals, and hopefully, as the European Union says, a Green Deal, as Bernie Sanders and Alexander Ocasio-Cortez say, a Green New Deal that really is infrastructure driven through a complete change of energy, public transport, corporate agriculture becoming, localized and organic, cities becoming more compact and less sprawly, waste systems becoming zero waste oriented, not the kind of methane spewing landfills we've got, corporates, being wound down, the big oil companies nationalized.
Just one question, Patrick, for our audience, particularly Pakistani audience. When President FDR, Franklin Roosevelt, instituted this New Deal in the 1930s to respond to that crisis. In a nutshell, what did it encompass? What was this New Deal?
Well, the first thing was they had an incredible problem of poverty, and they had two socialist parties and a communist party that were really drawing increasing support. And FDR, as a Democrat, coming from the ruling class, was the kind of person who could go to the capitalists, to J.P. Morgan, the big banker, and just say, you're broken now. We're not going to let you do the kinds of things that got us into this mess. So in the sort of respect that the power balance allowed a revolutionary threat in the Soviet Union of some sort of threat there, the prestige that it had. At the same time, mass poverty broke out with the Great Depression. So it included big public works projects, right? And including cultural and aesthetic improvements in the US. Wonderful pieces of art were publicly subsidized, and new buildings for public use, schools and libraries, all from the 30s have this, delightful, partly Art Deco, but, kind of a delightful sense that the state can get out and fill the gaps that capitalism will leave. And then there was Social Security. So at the beginning of, 37, 38, they began to allow elderly people to have some security of income. And that was done as not that you've paid in already, because they just started it. It was called a pay-as-you-go, so they could get the security. And then, one of the big things that really destroyed the, let's say, excess capacity in the capitalist system was World War II. And I'd say if it wasn't for that period, 39 to 45, where the manufacturing capacity of Japan and Germany and much of Europe really was blown to bits by the Allied powers, Germany doing a lot of damage as well. If it had not been for that, it might not have been a golden era, as they called it after that. Right. Namely, you have to kind of destroy the economic deadwood of overcapacity, and a war usually does that well. But we've been seeing that here the last year and a half or so, even before COVID-19 hit. Yeah. The overcapacity problem was serious, and the destruction was beginning. I can say that from South Africa, with a traditionally very strong steel industry, we lost ArcelorMittal, right? The Indian entrepreneur Lakshmi Mittal had made the biggest steel company in the world. And even before COVID hit, he shut down the second largest foundry because of overcapacity. So the conditions from the 1920s and 30s of overproductive capacity that Karl Marx would theorize in Das Kapital, that many Marxists would point to, the term we use is overaccumulation of capital. And especially from the east coast of China, where the vast majority of the world's steel was being produced. And then, as often is accused, they were dumping. They were selling below the full cost of production. They didn't calculate, environmental costs. Trade unions are not allowed to organize properly. And the local pollution and the global pollution, the shipping costs, none of those are really incorporated properly. And the allegation is that China kept its currency low. What that means, Junaid, is that like the 30s, a Great Depression, or it's called here, and in the West, it's sometimes called secular stagnation. It's a sort of polite word for saying there's a capitalist crisis and there isn't enough effective demand. Now, the difference between then and now is that the older era had very tight monetary policies, and what the era since 2007 and 8, especially with the big financial meltdowns in September, October 2008, did you hear the word quantitative easing? I don't know if in Pakistan that's been tried to keep the economy afloat. It basically means the central bank will bail out the financial system and print lots of money. And what that also means, instead of inflation, the great fear, what that also means then is you get financial bubbles. So I still feel we're not really at the point of the Great Depression with a full-fledged financial collapse, but I fear that's maybe where we're going. And then, to get out of the Great Depression, let's say World War II is critical because it wiped out that economic deadwood. Then the question is, what do you do to arrange the world economy in the 40s at a place, Bretton Woods Hotel in New Hampshire, where the Western elites gathered, and essentially it was two countries against all the others. The two countries were the one that had the gold in a place, Fort Knox, Kentucky. Yeah, that's where the U.S. has its vaults. So they kept all the world's gold there that they'd accumulated by being a surplus country and trading and lending. And they took everyone's gold. But there was still a lot of gold here in Johannesburg. So those two countries, right, South Africa and the U.S. got together. And the leader of the opposition, the debtor countries, was John Maynard Keynes. He's the most famous capitalist economist. And he had the idea we should have a world economy run with a world financial institution that could issue currencies and, in a sense, maintain a balance from the center and penalize excesses in trade. And with his idea of a sort of reserve currency and with a trade management, he thought you could get these capitalist problems under control. He lost. And that was because he was representing the losers, the debtors, Britain and the other countries from the Bretton Woods meeting. And he was frustrated. 2 years later at the next negotiation in Savannah, Georgia in 1946, he had a heart attack after losing his debates and on the way home to Washington, then another one in London, and he died age 62. Now, those experiences where they put gold at the center, $35 for an ounce of gold was the way it worked. That allowed the U.S. to be stable and to run a world economy with the dollar right at the center as a sort of fiat currency. And that's continued. They've been able to say, we have the dollar, the single most valuable currency that everybody trusts, and it's retained value, and it really shouldn't. But that Nixon defaulted. The former President Richard Nixon, very notorious as a criminal who he ordered the break into his opponents, and he had to quit early. But he actually did something very naughty.
Which of course is this is what he got, kind of caught for. But of course, a far greater criminal for that, for the bombings of Cambodia and Laos and so on. So,
oh, yeah. Absolutely. What Nixon and especially his Secretary of State, Henry Kissinger, did was to amplify, even in a period before Ronald Reagan and before George Herbert Walker Bush and Clinton, and George Bush and Obama and Trump, but the notion of U.S. imperialism and control over Latin America. Of course, he inherited the Vietnam War from Lyndon Johnson, but it's that, let's say, exercise of power and the injustice associated with it that meant he had no qualms about defaulting on that deal, because the U.S. actually began to lose its gold when it was investing a lot in Europe. Europeans had dollars, they wanted to change for gold. So with the gold price now at $35, he just said, no, we're not going to play by that set of rules. So Bretton Woods fell apart. And that's when we really get the casino starting up. That's when the financialization, or the ability of liquid financial assets to move as they deregulated.
That's what I really wanted you to focus on. I mean, what is neoliberalism, and how financialization, and of course deregulation, privatization, but specifically when we speak about moving from a productive kind of investment economy to the financialization, because I think this is, if you wanted to put it in very simplistic terms, this is what we've seen really in the global economy. So a little bit about that kind of that our audience would kind of get a sense of kind of what has gone on for the past now 50 years.
That's right. In fact, some would put it at about 50 years ago, 1973, because that's when the Milton Friedman ideology was imposed on Chile, right? 1971, a coup, and then the 1973 it was a coup against the Social Democrat Allende. Was that 73? And then came the Chicago Boys, Milton Friedman, based at the University of Chicago, and the dictator of Chile had enough military power just to impose the neoliberal agenda. The critical link between what I just said, which is that the older system broke down, the Bretton Woods system fell apart, meant that finance started flowing freely. And many of the, that year, 1973, the oil revenues that came from OPEC, the oil-producing exporting countries, they then put their money into New York banks, petrodollars, and that was recirculated to poorer countries. So even as South Africa started,
this is a very critical point that actually gets lost in all of this. The petrodollars coming in from the Gulf, and how those petrodollars then become recycled to kind of create engender this debt crisis, this global debt crisis of the third world.
That's right. So those are, let me just say, 3 or 4 critical moments. Let's just think of them again. Bretton Woods system breaks down in 71, really falls apart by 73. The dollar and gold price starts swinging. Dollars are produced and it creates inflation, and the gold price soars. In fact, it went to 850. You can imagine here in Johannesburg, the white racists who were running, in Pretoria, the capital, in Johannesburg, the business center, they were delighted to see the gold price go to $850. Right. So gold and the dollar, which had been the basis of stability, fell apart because the U.S. institutionally broke the link. Institutionally, Pinochet came to power through a coup and brought neoliberal ideology through Milton Friedman, the economist, and Los Chicago Boys. And then the OPEC countries institutionally could recirculate funds from poorer countries that were now spending much more on their imported petrol. They went to the New York banks, which went back to the poor countries, often, to dictators who would buy guns with the money they were borrowing. That kept their credit rating higher, because they could put down their people, and then they could borrow more money, and it became this terrible, vicious circle. So what I've just said are some institutional factors. But, underlying this is, a lot of economists are happy just to talk about institutional changes. But really, the underlying dilemma is the beginning again of overcapacity. And that creates a phrase that we use in Marxian political economy, uneven development, and that becomes much more out of control. So unevenness means, for example, the US starts in the 70s to deindustrialize as corporates find places like Mexican maquiladoras. First, they start in the south of the US, manufacturing plants where there's no trade unions, and then the Mexican border area, maquiladoras, and then they move to the Chinese, well, first to the next newly industrializing countries, which were Taiwan and South Korea and Hong Kong and Singapore, and then they move ultimately as China becomes more capitalist in the 90s. They really
when China agrees to play ball, then they realize the enormous profits to be made there.
Yeah. So what's happening at that stage is uneven development. That is the movement of a lot of physical productive capital out of the old centers, Western Europe and the Rust Belt of the United States. It moves and moves, and that spatial fix, a geographical strategy of capital to find, as you say, cheap places to produce. No trade unions allowed, environmental laws, who needs them, right? And then also bigger consumer markets that are just beginning to emerge. So finding these sites in East Asia especially was terribly important for capital as a spatial fix, as a geographical solution to this overcapacity and the turmoil in the Western economies. And the depressions that were beginning 1980, 81, 82 was because the interest rates were put up very high to rescue the dollar by the Federal Reserve. Gold price came down. South Africa went into a debt crisis. But as you can imagine, with the debt being so heavy, because these bankers were circulating the OPEC money, then dictators decided they'd give the debt to Democrats. And that gave us low-intensity democracy, right? So this is the sort of framing of the 80s. And we could see that from the democratic waves that began in the mid-70s in Spain and Portugal and Greece. And we saw this move through in the early 80s to the southern cone of Latin America. Chile eventually becomes free, breaks free of Pinochet's rule in a negotiated transition. Brazil, Argentina, Uruguay. And then it goes to Eastern Europe, right, in the late 80s, and begin to see, particularly from Poland in the early 90s, with the Soviet Union collapsing. Debt is too hard for the old regime to handle. It goes to East Asia in the 80s and comes to Africa briefly. So these waves of democratizations occur, but where the countries involved are so indebted that they actually have to follow the new rulers, which are in the Bretton Woods institutions, back to the World Bank and IMF. And so that's the story really of the 80s, 90s, and in many ways today, because their ideology, neoliberalism, is backed now by the desperation of these financiers and the debtors who have to pay the financiers. In this country, it's why we ended up with the kind of exit from apartheid we did in 1985, a debt crisis that in turn forced white capital to break away. They were tightly entwined. They were mostly what we would call English-speaking white South Africans, but they were entwined with the majority white Afrikaners who were in the government. But in this debt crisis, that broke, and that meant that the rich whites said, hey, actually now it's too expensive. We want to still export. Now we got sanctions. We've got a debt crisis. Let's get rid of apartheid. Let's give Nelson Mandela the debt. And it was about $25 billion. And I worked in his office in 94, 96. I could see.
And he said one of the other great works of Professor Patrick Bond. Yes, the elite transition.
Well, unfortunately, this is the question that often was asked of Mandela. Crude activists would say, including his late wife, Winnie Madikizela Mandela, this was a sellout, right? Too many concessions were made by the South African incoming democratic government to world finance and to local white people. And I think that's true. I wouldn't use the word sellout, but the balance of forces was very adverse because of this debt inherited. And the debt just became worse and worse, especially in the subsequent period. And that foreign debt, especially where you have credit agencies, I'm sure you know the names Standard & Poor's, Fitch and Moody's, because they're looking over the governments of South Asia just as they are of Africa, with the same threat. And Pakistan, along with South Africa, the highest is Turkey, pays an interest rate because we're junk rated, right? We have to kind of go begging for foreign loans just to pay the interest on the old debt. So we pay, in our case, it's about 9% on the 10-year government bonds. I think Pakistan's 9.5%. It varies a little bit, but it's ridiculous. ridiculously high interest rates. And that's this extraordinary loss of sovereignty that a South Africa and a Pakistan and many countries have suffered. It's not even the World Bank and the IMF at the moment. It's the financialization, the general casino. It's mutual funds of my relatives who are in Europe, and they have investments and they invest in sovereign debt just by virtue of who's managing their funds or their pension funds. So this is a very intertwined system where the labor aristocracies, if you will, of the North with pension funds are directly implicated in your and our austerity regimes in the South, so that the debt can be paid back to their funds instead of social spending on the people. And I think that dilemma, that's neoliberalism, isn't it? It's an ideology that says, let finance flow freely, get rid of exchange controls to keep money in the country, let interest rates float to their natural level, privatize your state assets, cut your social spending, promote export-oriented forms of capital accumulation.
Social spending on features such as health, education.
Cut taxes for the... Yeah. So that ideology has been so dominant that Nelson Mandela felt he had no choice but to accept it in managing this transition away from racial apartheid, but it created a class apartheid with much worse inequality. Today, this country, the worst in the world for what's called the Gini coefficient measuring inequality. In fact, this city is #1 in world inequality, Johannesburg. And this dilemma, right, of you take a state, and we asked ourselves in President Mandela's office, well, we've got the state, but actually, where's the power? The power isn't really in the hands of the democratically elected government. I'm sure that's something you're feeling in Pakistan as well. Absolutely. And I think this comes from this deep tendency of capital to have overcapacity to move around, but because you can get a higher rate of return at some stage, and it's especially when the interest rate goes up very high, thanks to Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve. I happened to work in the US Fed at the time. And as a result, if you're a treasurer in a company, you're GE, GM, Ford, well, why put more money into overcapacity plant and equipment in your sector? Your electronic goods or automobiles or steel, your basic sectors. Instead, you start the casino, because enough money is now flowing into various kinds of fictitious capital, financial assets, stock market shares, or debt markets of various sorts, or exotic.
And Patrick, the question there emerges. Many people have on their minds, and you will hear this quite frequently from very good economists. But briefly, if it could be spelled out, what is the relationship between that casino capitalist, the Wall Street stock market, and all these sorts of new terms, derivatives, sovereignty funds, and so on, and the real economy at this stage? What is the relationship between the two?
Well, all you have to say is the Dow Jones Index, the measure of the New York Stock Exchange, is at a world record, and the U.S. has just gone into an extraordinary decline. They haven't fixed their COVID problem. I'm hoping their vaccines will work, and they can then share the over purchasing of all the vaccines with Pakistan and South Africa and African countries. They're hoarding and they're greedy, as you know, but they have screwed that up so much that they don't really appear to be coming out of a recession. Joe Biden's putting an alleged $1.9 trillion stimulus to actually keep some form of money into people's hands. But I think it's very telling that the stock market boom occurs while the real economy is shrinking. It's a fictitious capital bubble that delinks from the real economy, just the way you're hinting. But this is an extreme version in the US, and yet it's typical of what's been happening, because this technique that they've used to get out of the 2008-9 meltdown, quantitative easing, they did that for about 4 years. Till 2013, they started to taper or to slow down.
Just pumps money.
They run the printing press.
Yeah,
that's right, and they usually will buy treasury bills and therefore take them off the hands of financiers, who then have buybacks of their corporate shares and raise the price of their shares and the managers' salaries. Inequality soars, and the quantitative easing is therefore a trickle up, or it's actually a flood up to the richest people, and they're the ones gambling. It's 93% of the US public does not have stock market shares. 7% do. oh, they've made out like bandits, so inequality has soared. We also have the same problem, Junaid. I don't know how it is in your financial capital, but in this city, Johannesburg, Sandton is the financial district.
Yes.
We have what's called it's called the Warren Buffett indicator. Warren Buffett's seen as the greatest investor, right, of all time.
Right.
And he says that the main thing he looks at is a Buffett indicator of the market capitalization. How much is that stock market bubbling over the GDP? So the market cap over GDP is your Buffett indicator. Well, ours has just hit 400%, which is a world record. I mean, Hong Kong has been higher, but for a full national economy, South Africa is the highest ever. So we've got a very rapidly shrinking real economy. It's between 6 and 8% crash, but our stock market also went to a record high in the past week. So like the US, it's a casino economy. And one of the reasons is actually because the major holding in this country is a Chinese company. It's the Facebook and Twitter of China. It's called Tencent. So by accident, South Africans have about 30% because one of the main investors, Koos Becker, made a big success of a bet at that point. So we have a very bubbly stock market that's unrelated to the real economy here, and it sucks in money. Right. My pension fund goes into this ridiculous Tencent that keeps an eye on the Chinese working class and smashes them through social credit. It's very embarrassing. But that's the kind of intertwined nature of our world economy, where financialization could mean bubbles bursting. So, for example, Tencent, right, this big, it's the biggest company in Asia. It crashed 18% in 2018 because the Chinese government said, stop bringing in this software from Japan, the video games, and it's confusing our kids' minds, and the stock just completely crashed 18%. So did my pension. So these are the sorts of ridiculous, processes of volatility, which to me mean that this quantitative easing strategy that was adopted again about a year ago as the COVID-19 crisis began to unfold, the US Federal Reserve said, okay, don't worry, we know what to do. We just throw money at the problem. And most of the other central banks did, but even middle-income countries started to use quantitative easing, funding their new deficits with central bank printing of money. Now, there's a whole theory, it's called modern monetary theory, of progressive Democrats like the Bernie Sanders types, saying, yeah, that's actually proof that the government can do what John Maynard Keynes suggested, print money when the real sector is sick, and thereby stimulate and have a new deal. And we need to do that with a Green New Deal. And so there is a logic. But what I think they're missing is this durable problem. And I would say from China, it's going to be coming back in a big way. And, because Pakistan is a critical part of the Belt and Road Initiative, and it's been the source, in Kashmir, of enormous geopolitical conflict, and Chinese and Indian troops were throwing each other off the Himalayas 7 or 8 months ago. This was a terrible reflection of the geopolitics that really emerged from this durable overcapacity, where China is desperate to push its route to world capitalism further to the west and set up not just the Belt and Road of, sort of big train lines and you have pipelines and a big highway through Pakistan to the Gadar port, but also to do that through shipping. So it's an extraordinary effort that's unlike the 2009, 10, 11 boom in China, which was infrastructure in China. And so the central question, which I hope you'll be teaching all of us, is the Belt and Road tenable if countries like Pakistan are actually very indebted and pay a high interest rate on its public debt, and if other countries along the Belt and Road have already begun to default? I mean, we've seen that a little bit in Kenya with the inability to pay for a major railroad that goes from Mombasa to Nairobi that the Chinese built, $3.5 billion debt, and Kenya can't pay. We're looking at a few of those projects in South Africa, huge loans, Chinese locomotives for rail lines, a fair bit of corruption in those, new Chinese coal-fired power plants and smelters being proposed, vast amounts of mega projects, which to me, Junaid, aren't the Green New Deal coming. That's the opposite.
No, of course not.
Building back worse,
No, of course not. And again, this will require another show, and I think because it's such a fascinating discussion, and I think that particularly for our Pakistani viewership, the insights to be gained from that would be enormous. But I did want to kind of come towards the end and and you were getting moving into that direction towards the geopolitics of it, in the sense that where do you, in of course, what we all, or at least I believe that the great Patrick Vaughan does have some secret crystal ball that can tell us where the economy is going. But particularly after the previous COVID year, and you have so many analysts writing about these about what is going to happen now, and fairly sometimes, I mean, people that were well respected observers and analysts, but you're getting quite a wide array of views of where the world is going to be heading post this virus. What is going to be the new normal? What is this global reset of economies and so on? All of this type of things, which, of course, some verge on conspiracy theory. All of this, but I would like your take on where do you see that going, and added to that, I'll just say it right now, the geopolitical position of the United States in the world today, because I think that's on the minds of a lot of people. You spoke about China and its Belt and Road Initiative, and quite frankly, people who have not done I mean, ordinary people who have not obviously looked at it into much detail, there can be we can empathize with a developing world, with the global South, which does want to see an alternative to the IMF, World Bank, Washington consensus that they've been used to for so long. With regards to Pakistan, it's a very separate story, which goes actually quite way back to the 1960s in terms also not. In fact, it was not really an economic alliance; it was a security alliance between the Chinese and Pakistanis. And I think at this particular point, it's clear that the why it's translated so much into also as part of BRI, but really even separately as it on its own. Is because right now the tensions between China and the United States are at such a peak that I think that Beijing does feel that its access to other ports, say in Gwadar in Pakistan, the way that it kind of pumped in this $50 billion into Iran, for example, at the peak of when we thought there was going to be a war on Iran, So I think that the Chinese also understand that right now in the South China Sea, the East China Sea, and all surrounded and circled, that they need other options as well. So, but that's a very separate discussion. It's a very important one in the coming future, and of course the relationship with Pakistan is a bit different from its relationship with other, say, African countries or so on and so. Very, very different. There's a book that came out, Patrick. I don't know the truth of this, but it was a very pithy saying. Andrew Small's book on the Pakistan-China axis, in which he argues that the closest bilateral relationship in the world, perhaps even closer than the U.S. and Israel, is China and Pakistan. It was a very tall claim coming from a mainstream establishment kind of think tank person in Washington, D.C. But to my knowledge, it has been kind of the most fair account, sophisticated, detailed account of the history of the relationship from the 60s between Pakistan and China. And again, that basically was built upon hostility towards India, the China-India war, and then the Pakistan. So it emerged from that context, but of course it's been, no matter whether it's in a military regime here or a civilian regime, the continuity has been very strong. So I know that's my part of this contribution, but please, this is your show.
Well, on the contrary, I really need to understand that, and I hope we can all understand not just let's say, the physical infrastructural manifestation of the China-Pakistan relationship through this controversial site, that includes the Kashmir debate. But I think the other thing we must talk about, maybe on our next visit, would be BRICS, because the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa alliance is now back to India for 2021. Don't forget in 2016 that fairly recent in power Narendra Modi tried to turn the BRICS in their Goa meeting into a Pakistan bashing session,
Yes.
in which Pakistan would be declared terrorist, and then China and Russia would be encouraged not to be linked to terrorism. Now, Russia brought that back in an oblique way when they hosted the BRICS this year, but it's it was a kind of a virtual meeting, didn't really carry the weight, but they did talk about, and Narendra Modi was pushing this, the terrorist threats. Now, of course, the Chinese would use terrorist threats to include Muslims and the Uyghurs and all. There's all sorts of ways to use that. We just have to thank goodness in South Africa we don't have that sort of ridiculous framing of politics. But it does strike me that, Junaid, the way to link to your earlier question, do we learn about imperialism, is partly because of the dangers of inter-imperial tensions. China and the US, I wouldn't call China imperialist, but I do think there's a sub-imperialism, and that is something people are understanding if they think somehow China offering with the China, Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank or the BRICS New Development Bank, an alternative to the IMF World Bank. No, it turns out that the IMF is increasingly owned by the BRICS. It's about nearly 15%. If they go to 15, then they get veto power. There'll be pressure not to allow that. But that, to me, Junaid, is such a critical question. Do the BRICS really represent an alternative to the Western power structure? Or, because of their implicated role in the IMF, in the WTO, and the big debate now is over vaccine IP, the intellectual property that people are saying we need a waiver to get vaccines and medicines for COVID-19. And in the WTO, in the IMF, in a variety of multilateral venues, we could talk for a long time about how the BRICS play a very destructive role in the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework on Climate Change, and the Paris Agreement, the Copenhagen Agreement in 2009, reflecting US power with 4 of the 5 BRICS. And I think there's a very important topic here, which is sub-imperial deputy sheriff functions, where the BRICS have a lot of answering for. Including South Africa,
and of course, as you know, Patrick. I mean, the BRICS itself, the initial hopes within it, even the very limited hopes. By now, what BRICS has become in the form of the national governments of India and Brazil, most strikingly. These right-wing governments very much allied to the United States, and this is what is making this whole kind of the Russia, China, the Shanghai Cooperation Organization, and their meetings almost, there's this enormous schizophrenic cognitive dissonance taking place within these regional powers, and because they know what India is doing, what's really going on, but it's still in BRICS, and so it's a very complicated affair here.
Well, we don't like medical metaphors, but if you want to use one, schizophrenic is exactly right, Junaid. Think of Bolsonaro, the Brazilian fascistic leader, in alliance with the West, with the US, the EU, with Britain, with Canada, with Australia and Japan, denying intellectual property waivers on these medicines, even though Brazil had, 20, 25 years ago, started the move to get AIDS medicines as generics and solve really the AIDS.
That's one thing that, India just cannot afford to do, because it is so, that's such a central actor. But of course, India may even be a greater irony because of its geographic positioning within an Asia that is trying to kind of integrate in some capacity, for better or worse. So India is really an outlier nation right now within the context of what's going on within the China, Russia, Central Asian integration, Pakistan, and so on.
Correct. So this is proving this point about both a deputy sheriff function. Let me call it sub-imperialism. The word comes from a guy called Rui Mauro Marini from Brazil, who and David Harvey, my PhD supervisor, picking that theory up to explain the spatial fix. But secondly, what is happening is very much the problem of inter-imperial rivalry after an economic crisis that I would go back 108 years to Rosa Luxemburg's theory of imperialism, right? Because she really identified how that overaccumulation and how that tendency to capitalist crisis compels the colonial powers with their corporations to exploit and to extract from their colonial terrains. But importantly, she said this is capitalism meeting the non-capitalist. And she included destruction of the environment as well as mutual aid systems or natural economies, the existing economies of the oppressed peoples that the colonialists had just disrupted because they wanted to take the land, take the resources, take the labor power. Those insights into imperialism, like Lenin, who described more explicitly in his 1916 pamphlet, Imperialism, the inter-imperial rivalries, those can be updated. And I think just to leave your viewers with a couple of ideas for further reading. Certainly, the core of neoliberalism has been explained by David Harvey, A Brief History of Neoliberalism, and Naomi Klein's The Shock Doctrine does a terrific job of making that real, and even in South Africa, where she stayed and worked a little bit. I think then you'd go to some extraordinary theorists, a couple of whom have just passed away. Samir Amin, a great Egyptian who worked most of his career in Senegal, and his theory was delinking, and that was to recognize circuits of the world economy are very destructive, and therefore protective barriers and exchange controls. And eventually he then, near the end of his life, also said the need to leave resources underground for future generations. These are terribly important parts of a full, holistic, intergenerational, feminist, ecological Marxism. And I think there are others. I mean, we lost 2 months ago one of the great geopolitical thinkers, Leo Panitch. And your viewers will no doubt be able to find.
Dear friend. Yes.
Yeah, mine too. And the main thing with Leo was the generosity of spirit that allowed him to go anywhere in the world. He was in Pakistan, he was in Turkey, Brazil, South Africa many times, really giving the most clear advice to the social movements to keep their struggles at a high pitch, even if their party took power, as happened here. And I think the other thing about Leo is he defined, with his colleague Sam Gindin, the institutional form of US imperialism in a book called The Making of Global Capitalism. My copy's right there, and we just had a tribute to him. It's fantastic big book. Your viewers can find it online in a pirate copy, I'm sure. And then I would point to an Asian theorist, Walden Bello, who's working continually. He's a Filipino, and has got an institute that he founded about 30 years ago that focused on the global South in Bangkok. And they really have begun to put this idea of the deglobalization process as a series of political strategies from below. To me, those are the people, Junaid, who've been in each of the different continents, really been central to an alternative. And of course, the most important ultimately is a post-capitalist vision. I take it from the Andes Mountains in Latin America, called Buen Vivir, Somakase, the strategies that you find in, there are various great theorists from that part of the world, and Edgardo Lander is part of the group of beyond development theorists. But we're finding them more and more in sites like, there's an Ecuadorian left indigenous opposition that, going to run for president against the Keynesian left. It's a fascinating country, Ecuador. I'm on my Ecuadorian hammock just thinking about where the Ecuadorians can teach us about left and center-left frictions and possible alliances. Bolivia's back in the left camp. So there's some excitement out there for futuristic thinking that would be post-capitalist, post-extractivist, right? The extraction of resources without any concern for.
That's probably a discussion I really would like for us to have in another show. I mean, because I don't think that there's a deep enough understanding of kind of the climate justice movements and the climate justice movements for against the climate catastrophe that's taking place within the world. I think that would be something which your expertise would do us good.
Well, let me leave you with one last reference, because again, it's online, it's a free download. It's a book called Pluriverse, which I hope would get us going for another discussion. I mean, you'd really want the editors, the greatest ecofeminist socialist theorist, Ariel Saleh, Ashish Kotari from India, Alberto Acosta from Ecuador, and Frederica de Maro from the Barcelona group of degrowth theorists, along with Arturo Escobar, a Colombian. And they're the editors of a book called Pluriverse, verse
Yes.
that will really set these things out. I have a small chapter with my colleague Ana Garcia about the BRICS, but maybe we'll get that into discussion because you really don't want somebody like me sitting in Johannesburg with extreme distortions and excess optimism based on defeating apartheid, defeating AIDS
I'm so
denial.
glad. I wanted to say that the one unique element that I do find about my dear friend Professor Patrick Bond, amongst many others, is there's an enormous spirit of optimism that I get from listening to you, from always speaking to you, etc. That you sometimes don't get from many from many well-meaning, well-intentioned political economists and people looking at the world. So, and that is something remarkable. That is something remarkable to give hope to our social movements and so on. And I think we may have lost Professor Patrick Bond, but I think we covered most of the topics that we wanted to cover. Not most, I think we covered all of it. It's a shame that I wasn't able to thank him at the end, but it was a true delight, as I think all of our viewers will acknowledge, of having Professor Patrick Bond on and his incredible, vast breadth of knowledge, prolific author. I mean, I would say encourage our viewers to read, to check out not only his books, but his, I mean, I would say by hundreds and hundreds of YouTube lectures on these topics, incredibly educational. So I would highly encourage our viewers to check those out. And Patrick, when he does see this again, I just want to thank him very much for sparing the time to be with us. We know that there are some power outages and these types of things going on there, but he somehow was able to circumvent this through, of course, Patrick's very optimistic special powers that he's blessed with. And so we are very thankful for him for attending our show, and thankful to all of you for being here with us. And assalamu alaikum. Thank you very much.